Dragon Age, more like... I guess there's no way to fit the word trans into that title at all, but just because you can't fit the word into the game's title, BioWare and the writers/storytellers that they hire have definitely found a way to fit trans people into the game itself. And in this video here, I wanted to explore the entirety of that idea. How well a group of people who have oft found themselves barely included in mainstream things found themselves put into this major RPG franchise. Something which is extra inspired by the recent release of Dragon Age Veilguard, and the innovative, fresh, and frankly should be normalized as the standard ways that that game engages with trans representation. I also think that's enough of an intro. You get the idea of what we're doing here. Talking about Dragon Age and trans characters, and you get why we're talking about it. It's got a new game out, and it's always good to see what different media is doing with representation, and you can sort of see where the conclusion is going. Did Dragon Age do a good job? And if so, what are the lessons that can be learned for other series to use if they also choose to include trans characters? With that all said, let's get into it with our first entry, that of a minor side character in Dragon Age 2.
We stand upon the precipice of change.
So, there is a character called Serendipity, who works at the Blooming Rose, the brothel in Dragon Age 2's Kirkwall, who is not just an elven sex worker, but also a drag queen. You can have sex with them, him, her. It's not really clear actually on what exactly the deal is here gender-wise, so I don't really know what pronouns to go with per se, but let's stick with them for now so that way I can cover my ass in either regard. But yeah, you can have sex with them as a premium service, See? Fucking a trans-adjacent character or trans-esque character is something you gotta pay a little more for, cause it's a bit exotic. Something that I'm sure quite a few Republican representatives have found out in their careers.
We're always happy to see young men with coin in their pocket.
Do you have something just for really bad boys?
Yes, this is truly something with not a lot to talk about because the game itself doesn't really go into it that much. I mean, there is a fun scene during the DLC Mark of the Assassin when you meet Seneschal Bran and Serendipity at a party, and the way that your characters interact with this drag queen do kinda make it seem like it's weird and something they're not super comfortable with, which is great.
Introduce me to your delicious friend.
And everyone here is so upper class.
No, hang on. Not great. The opposite of great. Shitty. Yeah, sort of shitty that you don't really get a huge amount of choice in acting like a normal person around this trans-esque character. And that reaction remains the same whether you have or have not previously slept with Serendipity at the Blooming Rose. So it just seems like the generic response to this frankly generic stereotype of a drag queen/trans character. Because, let's face it, media has a long history of conflating those two identities together into the same thing, and assuming that their cis audiences won't care or won't get the difference, which has been usually 100% true because nobody taught the cis audience better or was able to represent the difference to them. As I said, there really ain't much to discuss with this character that stands out, except for the fact that they do truly fall straight into what people assume of our community, being present in a sex worker capacity and only really in that capacity. A reference, of course, to the fact that a lot of trans people and gender diverse people became sex workers in the USA, and still do in some cases because there is not really much other work available to them, and you gotta pay the bills somehow. You know how trans people are afraid to be trans at workplaces?
I was terrified to work in a restaurant again, going to reject me. They're gonna beat me up, they're gonna murder me.
It's dangerous work for our minority with a very real threat of violence and being exploited, and that's not to say that we should ban sex work. I mean, Jesus Christ, just make being transgender not something people are afraid to be while working other jobs, and give sex workers more protections so that those who want to work in that industry are able to do so safely. Because what I really want to be driving at here is that this characterization in Dragon Age is built on a nasty stereotype that has a lot of baggage and history to it. Something that it doesn't care to do anything with or expound upon just so that it can merely use the existence of a drag queen / transgender sex worker as a funny bit.
What could he possibly do?
Sorry, Willie.
And this isn't just a thing that I'm saying, to be clear. I want to in fact reference a blog that will come up a few times during this video, specifically that of the Gaider archives, featuring a bunch of posts from David Gaider, the head writer for much of BioWare's stuff, until EA fucked the company and a bunch of people left / got fired after the debacles that were Andromeda and Anthem. Oh, yeah, just to be clear, I'm a huge BioWare fan. I've played all their games, even the bad ones, and I know all the lore. But a post on this blog does in fact cover Gaider's experience with writing trans characters, and with a lot of the hesitation that he had going into doing it. Specifically being worried about screwing up transgender representation, and also inciting horrible comments and aggression from both the fanbase and outside of the fanbase towards this trans representation that would be hurtful and upsetting to transgender fans. I mean, he literally opens the blog by saying that at the time when he posted this, about 12-ish years ago at this point, that video gaming was just not ready for a transgender main character, or major plot character, or even decent side character, but that despite that fact, the industry should still be pushing the envelope to do the work to normalize it, and make it work. And more relevant to Serendipity is the fact that he mentions the reaction to her, and the way that it was a wake-up call to realise how Serendipity could be perceived as a joke, and that when criticised on it, he felt bad because he agreed that they had screwed up on the stereotypes and the joke nature of the character. That despite the best intentions of the writing crew, they had messed up. Now, that's some good fucking introspection and willingness to learn from mistakes, because Gaider talks about how they saw this as an opportunity to consider what they would do to put in a good transgender character, how they would go about that, and what would be the driving motive for it. Not wanting to just put in a character to be trans, but desiring to have them be something else as well as trans. A pretty good and important thing, I think, for any writer to want to have with their characters. You know, you want them to be multi-dimensional after all, otherwise that's gonna be a shit character.
What brought you out here to Andromeda?
Back home, I was filling test tubes in some dead-end lab. People knew me as Stefan.
And so, working on the Dark Horse Dragon Age tie-in comics, Gaider decided to make an old friend of Varric's in the Tevinter Imperium not just this strong-willed rebellious woman, but also transgender. That's right, we're on to our next talking point, that of Magister Maeveris Tilani. Now, there is undeniably a lot more in this Gaider post to talk about here, some really interesting insights into Maeveris, but let's get the representation out of the way first, and then we can talk about the writer's opinions and experiences on them.
Now, let's not dwell on past mistakes.
So, Maeveris comes to us from, as I mentioned, the Dark Horse comics Dragon Age Those Who Speak and Dragon Age Until We Sleep, where she is effectively a minor character at introduction, though one who is intended to be transgender from the offset, as she meets Alistair and Varric at a big Magister ball, and effectively acts as a stand-in for us to see the Tevinter Imperium characters who are opposed to what the Tevinter Imperium is getting up to, and want to change it for the better. Her actual transgender identity is cemented though more in her second appearance, when she is found by Varric imprisoned in the cells of the main bad guy of the comic series, Titus, and we also get to see her later on during a fade sequence having a dream moment with her husband Torald, Varric's cousin and the main reason why he knows her and uses her as his Tevinter contact. And she gets help from Varric to break out of the fade delusion and go kick some ass. There isn't a huge amount more to talk about here specifically. I mean, yet again, this isn't a main character, it's not someone who has a large and significant role in one of the main games, it's a side character from a side project. But it is the first serious and real attempt by Dragon Age to put a trans character into their world, seeing as Serendipity was never intentionally meant to be any trans-related thing, and was just a poorly inserted drag queen that represented the way that cis people don't quite understand the differences within our community. And so, in that regard, having Maeveris be this powerful and respected by the good guys character as a woman is something that I think can be viewed to be beneficial in a first serious attempt at trans representation. Sure, there are certain panels and choices with regards to body presentation that I know people have taken umbrage with, and that also lead to David Gaider in that blog we keep referencing, having second thoughts about how he approached Maeveris in Dragon Age Until We Sleep, concerns of sexualization and hyperfixation in the art that I do think are fair concerns to have and issues to take, and the best outcome of that is to do what David Gaider did, which was take the information on board and go and ask a trans colleague in the gaming world what they thought and what changes that person would suggest be made. I mean, I know, radical stuff here, evolving from criticism and deciding to include the voices of the minority group being represented in the conversation and in your journey towards becoming a better writer. That's almost unheard of, and yet it does kind of sound as if it really should be the standard. But it is undeniable that Maeveris is at least positive in conception and positive in direction, even if you might see flaws in the execution of her. The comic at no point treats her as anything but a woman, and goes out of its way to make it clear that the people whose opinions we should care about, because they're the heroes of the story and not the asshole, sexist, homophobic and racist dickheads of the villainous Tevinter, all see her as who she sees herself as and is. Her story is also an interesting one, something that you can find more from in Dragon Age: The World of Thedas Volume 2, also published by Dark Horse Comics, wherein we learn more backstory about Maeveris and how she came out at a young age and was allowed to do so by her father, who was seen as weak by the rest of the Imperial Senate, leading to him being executed and her having to fight her way through her family's enemies to get her estate and claim her place as a Magister. All done through the fact that she is an incredibly powerful mage and strong-willed person who doesn't take shit from anybody, and in some ways represents the tenacity of the trans community in fighting for our rights, a metaphorical equivalence that I am certainly far from opposed to seeing given that kind of connection. I definitely like to see my trans characters deal with hardships, but overcome them, rather than be merely positioned as victims to be pitied and saved. We want empathy and respect, not pity when cis audiences come away from seeing our stories and hearing about our lives and struggles. Now, Maeveris does reappear fully in the latest addition to Dragon Age, Veilguard, but she is actually quite a minor character in that game too, being more of a fun cameo that is exciting for people who know who she is, rather than someone that we really get a lot of lore and interaction with.
They were expecting a young man, but we decided that I would show them who I truly was.
A friend of mine who doesn't know Maeveris had no idea that she was trans, till I pointed out the fact that Taash, the non-binary character who we will get to when it becomes chronologically convenient to do so, don't you worry, mentions having a conversation with Maeveris about gender identity, and coming out. That is a nice little reference to this much older and much more experienced trans character in the lore, giving some tips and aid to a fresh trans person. Another thing that I appreciate for the fact that it showcases the power of having that community, of having those trans elders around who can talk to and share with the rest. It's something that isn't given its due respect as often as it should be, especially because of how much the queer community as a whole suffered a mass loss of elders thanks to a little thing called the AIDS crisis, when our minority was left to die because the government was happy to view the disease as just a gay problem, and therefore not worth bothering with. Thanks, Reagans, you absolute pieces of shit. Hope you both like the fires of hell. But yeah, so that's kinda all I have to say on Maeveris. And at this point you might be seeing this as a steady progression of quality. The writers are clearly getting better and better at doing this, and a lot of that speaks to a willingness to want to learn how to do better, and also to take that initial risk of putting a trans character into the game / side comics, because even if it would not be well received, you have to make those steps and those efforts to force it to become something that is normal. Otherwise, you basically just concede the point to the bigots, which are, generally speaking, the last people you want to let run your fandom and your franchise.
Sorry, did you want to get immersed in our world? Yeah, well, guess what? Fucking pronouns!
I'm aware in saying all of this, and referencing Gaider's blog here, that there are a lot of things that connect to Taash and Veilguard, and how that was received from what Gaider said. I get that every single concern that David Gaider raised was realised imminently by the hordes of culture war tourists and right-wing pundits tearing into Veilguard for featuring a prominent non-binary companion character, as well as transgender options for your main character. But let's holster that conversation for now, as we move out of the David Gaider era and into the Trick Weeks era. That's right, it's a different person in charge as lead writer of the franchise now, and this new writer is even one who came out as non-binary themselves, so that gives a little bit of hope to the ability to bring personal experience to the writing, right? Right? That seems right.
Something's on its way into the
Well, that ominous moment leads us into our next character, Krem from Dragon Age Inquisition. A character which it turns out has been quite divisive amongst queer fans of the game. I'm gonna say this here right now, and will probably repeat it for Taash. If you find issues with a trans character and how they are presented, issues that I might not share specifically, it doesn't mean that either one of us is wrong. It just means that every trans person is looking for something a little different in representation, and maybe are not gonna be convinced by the same things. And that's fine. The only real way to fix that is to have more trans characters, have more trans people that fill multiple roles and identities and ways of being that allow everyone to find that character that speaks to them specifically, and gives them the good vibes of getting to see yourself represented in a game. With that disclaimer said, Krem is a side character in Iron Bull's group, the Chargers, and is a major part of his personal questline, being the second in command of the squad.
I don't want any of those Tevinter bastards getting away. No offense, Krem.
None taken. At least a bastard knows who his mother was.
Now, from the outset, for your interactions with the group, you wouldn't immediately know that Krem is transgender. There is no instant scene explaining it, and he just seems to be one of the lads, getting in on the ribbon and the masculine vibe of the Chargers as a group. A masculine vibe that is really epitomised by the jostling conversations between Krem and Iron Bull. It's only later, during a drinking scene with the Chargers, that Krem's gender identity is brought up at all as something that the Inquisitor is able to engage with. And that leads to the Inquisitor then being able to be more, well, inquisitive about Krem's background and backstory. That backstory being that Krem grew up acting as a boy and wanting to be a boy, that his family sold themselves into slavery and so he joined the army and bribed a healer to ignore certain biological factors that would have restricted him from doing that in the regressive and, as we have also mentioned, homophobic, transphobic, sexist, slavery-using, racist society of Tevinter.
How little you know, my pet. And this is your new master, then?
Before the healer was replaced and Krem fled after his trans secret was revealed, being rescued by Iron Bull and joining the Chargers from that point onwards. Now, within all that I have said here, there are some things that came up and that have caused problems with some people, because as far as it currently stands, Krem seems like pretty decent representation for trans men, right? A group who often seem to get forgotten when the conversation about trans people comes up. But the problem is the way that your Inquisitor engages with talking about Krem's identity is a little bit crude. Your options are relatively limited to that kind of brute curiosity that some cis people engage in, such as asking Iron Bull if he has a problem with Krem being a her, you know, a little bit transphobic in an unwitting way, hopefully, or asking Krem why he thinks he's a man. And I do get those annoyances there, because it's not so much an issue with Krem as it is an issue with how you are forced to present your own Dragon Age Inquisition character as someone unfamiliar with transgender identity, and who say somewhat offensive and insensitive stuff because they don't know better if you actually want to learn more from Krem. Like, learning more trans info requires you to be a little bit bigoted, and that doesn't necessarily sit 100% great with a lot of people. And I imagine really sucks if you had headcanoned your Inquisitor to be trans, because these character interactions really crush that hope and eject you from the immersion.
Why did you decide to live as a man?
I didn't decide anything. I've been like this my whole life.
Another issue that some people have taken with Krem is the fact that Krem has a female voice actor, Jennifer Hale specifically. Oh, shit. Commander Shepard.
Are you naturally this bitchy or is it just me?
Which for some people felt as if it was kind of falling into that trap of having a trans character but giving them all these behind the scenes cis affects that sort of feel as if they are confirming the non-reality of who they identify as. It's a complex issue, and it's one where I can seriously say that I understand people having problems with that or feeling that way, because there are plenty of times when that does seem to be the attitude of the creators. But on the flip side of that, there are the people who argue that without access to HRT or any of the modern medical advances that we have which allow trans men to align themselves more strongly with how they see themselves, that Krem would be sort of stuck with biological elements from their assigned gender. And while I can see where those people are coming from, surely the creators could have put some magic element in that allows for transitioning to occur? What with this being a fantasy series? I mean, Krem mentions the fact that people do transition using blood magic, which is something he isn't super comfortable with, and that a lot of people in Dragon Age are not comfortable with, but I mean, come on. People can summon fireballs and make their skin rock hard. Surely you can do a little gender transition without going to blood magic. Just go to that mirror in the Black Emporium. It's literally called the Mirror of Transformation. Unless, of course, the Antiquarian is keeping the process of transition from the masses because he's a huge piece of shit. And then, in that case, where is my story about freeing transition magic from that goddamn stealing bastard?
Would you consider allowing me to acquire your hand?
Come on, Trick Weeks, it's all there, but also we need not guesstimate what the writers were thinking or feeling, as despite Trick Weeks not having a personal blog post for this character, they do have an official BioWare site post about it, so we literally can hear all about it from the horse's mouth. There were 3 major takeaways from Trick Weeks talking that I think play some part in how we have to look at Krem, and that's 1, the writing team went into this experience having in their mind the community criticism of making trans people into either villains or the butt of a joke, and wanted to avoid doing that.
Check out this dude in the dress. Me freak. Come away. Didn't mean for him to go over the bridge.
But the real tragedy.
2, they wanted to ensure that this character wasn't someone who just existed to express their trans identity, and had purpose beyond that. And 3, this version of Krem was not just something that was worked on by the Dragon Age team. It was put through people within the community, and feedback was given about some errors that didn't make it to the final draft. And I think we can see from those elements that continuation of the theme of Dragon Age as a series trying to grow and to get better with how they present gender-diverse characters. Being clear in the fact that they want to do this thing that for all intents and purposes it would be easier to just not do at all, and that even if you disagree with the end result being the best it could be, the process to get there was one that really did try at the very least to be as good as they could make it. As Trick Weeks says, there was originally going to be a joke from Iron Bull where he would bring up Krem binding, and the community members who gave insight directed them away from that, because it would make Iron Bull into a massive jerk who is effectively being bigoted to their supposed best friend. Something which goes against the intended characterization of those two's relationship. And so this transformed into Krem bringing it up instead as a joke because he's comfortable with his identity enough to be able to make digs about it.
Yes, for your pillowy man bosoms. Let me know if you need help binding. You could really chisel something out of that overstuffed look.
Now, unfortunately, it seems as if some of these bigoted expressions got moved onto the player character instead in how they express themselves towards Krem. But Trick Weeks mentions that here too, stating how that was a mistake and that in the future they would look to provide more diverse options that allow a player to not be forced into having to act like a confused, accidentally transphobic person just to get more information from a transgender character. And I think getting these insights is great. It is fantastic to see writers being willing to receive feedback and filter through it to see the criticisms that can help them be better writers in the future, and allow more players to have experiences that match with their role-playing desires. It's that willingness to improve that I think does give Dragon Age an edge with pushing the boundaries of minorities in gaming, because it's going to let you keep coming back better and growing from any mistakes that you have previously made, and not just treating them as a mistake, don't do it ever again, but as a mistake to be learned from. And that brings us to our final thing to consider here with Dragon Age. The most recent thing that I feel like most people who watch this episode will be thinking of when I mention trans stuff in Dragon Age: Veilguard.
You have no idea what you have done.
Now, I want to make it very clear here at the very beginning of this segment that I'm not here to discuss the overall quality of the game. I'm not doing a review of Dragon Age Veilguard as a role-playing experience, and any conclusions that I reach are conclusions specifically about the trans aspect of the experience. It is a minute, precise element of the game, and is not meant to be a comment on its entirety. Whether you liked Veilguard, hated Veilguard, loved Veilguard, don't even know what Veilguard is, and if that's the case, hey, to the people who don't know, you can play games other than Baldur's Gate 3, you know. It's not a terrible idea to take a break from it every now and then, but no matter what your opinion on Dragon Age is, in isolation, the trans aspect is not dependent upon how you feel. Okay, with that noted, there are two things to talk about here, and I will start with the more controversial one, but the one that I think is actually the more boring, and that's Taash.
Taash, do you like being a woman?
Nobody likes being a woman.
During the course of the game, you get to find out some interesting facts about your companions, and a big one for this dragon-hunting Rivaini Kunari is that they don't really identify with the woman label that they were assigned at birth, and they come out to you as non-binary, specifically using that exact term during a scene one time. Now, this is another character that is directly written by Trick Weeks. Wow, crazy. A trans person wanting to put more trans people into their game? What a wild thing. No way anybody could have seen that coming. And while there are lots of criticisms about Taash's storyline and their presentation as a kinda moody, teenager-esque person who's very blunt, I think that their gender identity and its presentation is pretty bog standard coming out stuff. They feel uncomfortable, they talk a bit about it, they have a big coming out moment, there is some difficulty with family or friends around it, ultimately they push through and become accepted, and they finish by being who they always saw themselves as. It's like a queer version of the hero's journey. Once you've seen a few LGBT stories, you sort of feel like you might have seen them all. Taash doesn't do a huge amount within the game to mark it as distinctly different from this formula too. It's not really that radical of a coming out non-binary story, except for the fact that it's an explicitly non-binary character expressing themselves as that in a video game, which apparently for some people was a bridge too far into woke territory for Dragon Age, a series that, as you might have guessed from everything in this video so far, was already pretty fucking woke.
Did you always know?
Yes, it's not the most fortunate thing to know about yourself growing up in Tevinter, one rung above slavery.
I mean, David Gaider and Trick Weeks have been pushing in that direction for ages. It's not that much of a surprise to anyone who isn't some Grums-esque screaming about pronouns culture tourist warrior, and those people aren't even real fans. They're just dipshits dipping their toes to get people mad and farm attention. They don't know any of the lore at all, and they keep proving it. So fuck them. The only thing about Taash that I really do want to stop on and discuss in further depth here is the fact that they use the term non-binary. The first time that anyone in Dragon Age has used that term, or indeed any of the more modern transgender queer terms in conversation, and the way that a lot of people seem to have mixed opinions on that terminology specifically being used.
So, I'm non-binary.
What does that mean?
The argument goes that Dragon Age is a medieval-esque fantasy allegory, and that this language has a much more modern feel and vibe to it that doesn't mesh with the world that we have been presented. And while I do understand where people are coming from on that, and if you feel as if it being used broke your immersion, I'm sympathetic to your plight. But at the end of the day, I view all the common language stuff that is expressed as merely just a translation of the language that people are really speaking into something that we can somewhat understand and connect with. Like, English as a language doesn't exist in Dragon Age. Almost none of the terms that are being used are ones that make any etymological sense to be used. Like, if you're gonna get mad at the non-binary thing, and to be clear, I'm not saying everybody's getting mad, but you know there are those with fair criticisms, and there are those who are using fair criticisms to build out their own personal attacks, which are mostly just inspired by wanting to go after anything from the queer community in any medium.
This is what happens when you allow woke transgender activists to infiltrate your game and control everything about it.
But, like, you could make the same arguments about them using the term elevator, or having man and woman as options for gender at the start of the game. Like, those are all terms that would not necessarily be something that exists within Thedas. They don't have that same etymological history, but we see the common language of the world, the one used by humans in Tevinter and Orlais and Ferelden and the Free Marches in Navarra and Rivain and Antiva. We see that language translated into whatever language you are playing the game in. And so whatever Taash actually called themselves in that scene, well, the closest equivalent in our language was non-binary. I mean, other languages are used in Thedas. The Kunari language is mentioned throughout Taash's storyline, and we even see the somewhat genderqueer term that the Kun use, that of a Kunathlok.
In Kunadar, Krem would be an Akunathlok. They are real men, just like you are.
Birth was a Kunathlok. Perhaps you are like that.
Why do you have to keep picking at it?
Which is more based on the way that gender for the Kun is tied to the role one fills. For an example, the military. Being a soldier is a masculine thing. It is what men do, and therefore anyone who engages in the military, despite their biology or gender identity before that, is a man. There is a lot to discuss there in regards to the wider way in which gender presents differently around the world, but what we see is that Taash identifies as non-binary outside of that Kun idea of it, because the Kun idea is still stuck in those two binary modes. Because they were not raised in the Kun, and therefore have a concept that is more aligned with the Rivaini form of male and female, and existing outside of that. Look, it's a lot of minute stuff that I think really drags away from the fact that a lot of people sorta do like Taash, and a lot of people found Taash to be disappointing as far as trans rep goes. It's a pretty mixed bag, and I sort of think that's going to be true for almost all forms of characterization we get. Because until we get more of it, you're just not going to get the coverage that you need to be able to appease the trans community fully. But on that note of more trans rep, we get to the big thing about Veilguard that I really want to talk about. The big, unique thing that is the most special and most amazing thing we have ever seen, that really pushes the inclusion of trans people into video game history, and something that almost no other mainstream RPG has so far managed to successfully pull off, and that's letting you, the player, roleplay as a transgender person.
There he is, the man I knew I was.
Now, when I say that, I don't mean that you get to pick your pronouns, though that is also a thing you get to do. I also don't mean that you get to choose whatever body you want, like having a dick as a girl or chest scars as a man, though that is also available to you. No. Those are all things that have been done before, and sure, they give you a visual confirmation that allow for an audience to more easily headcanon that trans fact. But what Dragon Age lets you do here is it lets you specifically choose to have your character identify as transgender through in-game options, and then gives you dialogue responses and specific conversations that are based around that trans identity. That's right, it's no longer just up here, it's in the actual fucking game, and that is revolutionary. That is something that needs to be shouted from the rooftops more and more as something incredible. Something that nobody, not even that aforementioned Baldur's Gate 3, has pulled off. What it translates to specifically in the game, because the specifics are important to understanding the impact that it has, is that at a certain point you will be asked as the player character to select some things about yourself that you want the game to know, choosing from a wheel that contains stuff like tattoos and scars and, yes, gender identity. Now, this is obviously where a lot of, I think the nice word for them would be reactionaries, decided to farm a bunch of their clicks from, being both upset at this minor inclusion that you could just totally choose to ignore and move on with your day rather than clicking on it, and also being upset because a few of them screamed that this was being forced down their throat, that their character was being turned into a trans person before their very eyes, with no way out for these poor cis people.
It says this makes me trans. This one does, and this one.
I don't know why I have to be trans, guys.
Except that you could just hit the back button and not select the options that designated your character as trans. I don't know, if you're too stupid to see that clear back choice available to you, then you need more help than I think any of us can offer. But let's face it, in reality it's people being deliberately obstinate to stir up drama and have a big old bitch and moan about something that doesn't matter. For our purposes here though, the actual options themselves are more interesting in reflecting a continuing theme throughout the game when it comes to trans identity, which is that you are allowed some input in regards to how you want your character to consider being trans and view their place in the transition journey. Whether they're newer to it and maybe struggling with seeing themselves as whatever they've transitioned to, or if they're more adjusted and settled with who they are. That's great, because the more choices you offer people here allow for more people to see their own personal headcanons be realised in the game, and given weight by the story and the characters who you can comment about your trans identity to. Those characters you can tell about this identity include Taash when they choose to come out to you, and you get to connect with them over that shared realisation and express your own personal involvement in gender diversity. And you also get to bring it up to your romance partner when you've selected to really go for someone, letting you choose once again to mention it and see how this person reacts, not necessarily forcing you to have to do it, but giving the ability.
So, what? You just changed?
This is all, like I said, incredibly revolutionary stuff. I mean, we just don't really have a AAA game metric for this kind of inclusion, and so anything that happens here is sort of breaking barriers. But to have written it in a way that doesn't just force trans people into a monolith with their Rook characters, but lets you be somewhat flexible in how you want them to express being trans, and to also let that identification have some bearing on conversations with people when it's relevant, I mean, that's sort of the ideal level of inclusion. I think way too many people are getting wrapped up in the Taash drama for Veilguard, a drama that is really accentuated by the fact that a lot of people are disappointed in their storyline / romance beyond just the non-binary bits, when realistically we all need to be making it very clear how huge this RPG protagonist getting to be trans is. Every other RPG game that has done trans options before this, Cyberpunk, BG3, you name it, all of them have been merely stuck in the aesthetic and visual elements, with no real way to further explore or include that in your story. What DATV has done here is set the bar at a new point for what inclusion should look like going into the future. If you're going to give us the options to select chest scars and to give our female presenting characters dicks and pick they/them for pronouns, then why not consider putting in the effort of also giving us some minor scenes and minor comments in dialogue that connect to that identity that a lot of people from the community, and even some people not from the community, I see you cis people wanting to play trans characters, good on you guys, getting into some of that role-playing after all. But that all of these people clearly do want to express and want to get to see their character connect with that identity. And so that's Dragon Age. And to answer the question of trans success or trans failure that I have made the center part of this video essay, I would say that Dragon Age and its writers have always been trying to learn and to do better. Always trying to push the envelope, despite the very realised fears that the gaming industry and its audience have a lot of reactionary elements that will respond negatively to any minority inclusion. But like David Gaider said, while the gaming industry might not be ready, that is no reason to not do it. It's the job of the creators to change how things are, and not just bow to the whims of the loudest and most bigoted groups. Sure, Dragon Age hasn't always got it 100% right. Sure, people can take issue with some representation and find fault with how it connects to them or comes across, but I have no doubt that the people at BioWare will take every game they release as a chance to hear the criticisms and see what they can do better next time, and will continue to be on the frontier for inclusivity in gaming.
Because once I learned that I could feel that way about myself, I was never going back.
So, if you liked what I said here, or enjoyed it, or thought it was a good effort that explained things well, then please consider going to my Patreon and signing up. The names of those in the $5 and up category should be scrolling past the screen right now, and I really do appreciate everyone on there for allowing me to keep making videos like I do. Things are a little bit tricky right now, I know, and that's certainly true for everywhere in the world. Trust me, New Zealand is not a huge amount better. The government just cut like 2,000 hospital worker jobs. So any little that people are able to give goes a long way to paying the rent, food, power, internet, and yes, indeed, cat. Here is the cat. I had many people saying that I can't mention the cat without bringing him up. This is Merlin. He is a little nightmare monster who just destroys everything in my house, but is also a huge snuggle bug too, so you know, take what you can get. But, oh, he's destroying the camera right now. But all the money on there does allow me to have some security with making these videos, especially seeing as sponsorships are few and far between. Stop it, Merlin, please stop. Sponsorships are few and far between for a YouTuber of my level, forcing me to be reliant upon the goodwill of others to get paid for my work. The Patreon also helps inspire me to keep working hard on these videos. It does give me the sign that there are those who like what I am doing so much they will pay to see me keep doing it. And that's not something that I ever would have expected when I started doing this 4 years ago, as merely just a way to keep my mind occupied when I worked at an atrociously boring and dull retail job that crushed my spirit and mind. Hello? So yeah, thank you to all those people who have been on the screen, and also thank you to everyone else on my Patreon, as well as the rest of you who watched this video all the way through. If you want to leave a comment, share the video, or check out my other stuff on the channel, it would be much appreciated. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time with some more queer analysis shit.